James was working in his office, typing on his computer. The air was quiet, except for the sound of keyboards clicking. His desk was filled with papers, reports, and a half-empty coffee cup. He sighed and rubbed his temples. The screen was too bright. He had been feeling tired for weeks, but he thought it was just stress. His head started to feel heavy. His vision blurred. The words on the screen became fuzzy. His heart pounded. Then, suddenly, the world tilted. His body lost strength. He fell forward. The coffee cup tipped over. The sound of the cup crashing filled the room. His co-workers turned. James. Someone called his name, but he could not answer. Darkness swallowed him. His body lay still on the floor. The next thing he knew, he woke up in a hospital bed. White walls. The smell of antiseptic. A machine beeped beside him. His head was light. His body felt weak. He tried to sit up. A nurse walked in. "You're awake," she said with a gentle smile. "What happened?" James asked. His throat was dry. "You collapsed at work. They brought you here right away." His mind raced. Had he just been overworked? Before he could ask more, a doctor entered the room. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a calm voice. "James, we need to talk," the doctor said, holding a folder. James nodded, his heart pounding. Something felt wrong. "We ran some tests. The results are not good." The room felt colder. James's hands clenched the blanket. "You have a rare type of cancer," the doctor continued. James stared. The words didn't make sense. "No," he whispered. "That can't be right." The doctor's face was serious. "I'm sorry, James." His breath became short. The beeping on the machine sped up. "How long do I have?" His voice was barely a whisper. The doctor hesitated. Then, softly, he said, "Less than 6 months." Everything inside James shattered. His world collapsed. The hospital room suddenly felt too small. He couldn't breathe. "I have work. I have plans." His voice broke. "I know this is hard," the doctor said, his voice calm. James shook his head. "This isn't happening, not to me." Tears burned in his eyes. His body felt too weak to fight. The nurse placed a hand on his arm. "You are not alone." But at that moment, James felt like the loneliest person in the world. James lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He felt empty. The doctor's words echoed in his head. Less than 6 months. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He ignored it. Messages piled up. Friends, co-workers, even his boss. "James, are you okay? We're worried about you." He turned the phone off. He didn't want to talk. The world outside kept moving. His world had stopped. He had always followed the rules. Work, sleep, repeat. Now, none of it mattered. The routine felt pointless. He called his boss. "I need time off," he said. "Of course. Take care of yourself," the boss replied. James hung up. His job had been his whole life. Now, even that felt distant, like a dream. He pulled the curtains shut. The room grew darker. Days passed. He barely moved. Food lost its taste. He ignored the knocks on his door. "James, open up." It was Mark, his best friend. James stayed silent. "James, I know you're in there." Mark's voice was firm. James pressed his hands against his ears. He wanted silence. Tears burned his eyes. He wanted to disappear. Mark left, but James knew he would come back. The night stretched long. Sleep never came. He used to dream of the future. Now, there was none. His body felt heavy. Even breathing was exhausting. He used to love reading. Now, books sat untouched. His fridge was empty. He hadn't eaten in days. His reflection in the mirror was pale and hollow. Mark knocked again. James, at least let me in. James stared at the door. He felt frozen. He wanted to answer, but words failed him. The world outside moved on, but James remained still. His heart ached. He wasn't ready to face reality. Maybe tomorrow, he thought, but tomorrow felt far away. The next morning, James woke to loud knocking. James, open up. Mark's voice was firm but worried. James stayed in bed, hoping Mark would leave. But Mark didn't. The mocking continued. If you don't open, I'll break the door down. James sighed. He had no energy to argue. Slowly, he got up and unlocked the door. Mark pushed inside, scanning the messy apartment. Jesus, James, when was the last time you ate? James shrugged. Not hungry. Mark grabbed his wrist. Enough. You're coming with me. James resisted. I don't want to go anywhere. Mark didn't listen. He pulled James outside. The fresh air felt strange after days in darkness. Mark led him to a bar. We're drinking. James frowned. Drinking won't change anything. No, but it might remind you you're still alive. James hesitated. Then, he took a seat. Mark ordered 2 beers. Listen, James. You can sit at home waiting to die, or you can actually live while you still can. James stared at his drink, silent. Mark leaned in. What have you always wanted to do? James scoffed. No time for dreams now. Then make time, Mark said, before it's too late. James exhaled. The idea stuck with him. That night, he sat at his desk. A blank page in front of him. He picked up a pen, hesitated, then wrote. His final journey list had begun. First on the list, a trip with no plans. James felt a strange sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. Mark raised an eyebrow. What's that? A list, James said, of things I need to do. Mark grinned. Good, because you're not going alone. James was about to protest but stopped. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be alone. The bus rumbled down the quiet coastal road. James stared out the window, watching the ocean. The deep blue water stretched endlessly before him. For the first time in a long while, he felt small. Mark nudged him. Not bad, right? James nodded. It's bigger than I imagined. They stepped off the bus, greeted by salty air. The town was peaceful, with narrow streets and white houses. Fishermen worked by the docks, preparing their nets. Come on, Mark said, dragging James toward the shore. James took off his shoes, feeling the sand. The waves crashed gently, their rhythm calming. An old man sat nearby, mending a fishing net. Mark waved. Hey, need some help? The man chuckled. You know how to fish? Not really, Mark admitted, but we can learn. The old man studied them, then nodded. All right, come with me. The sea teaches patience. They followed him to a small wooden boat. James hesitated. Is this safe? The old man laughed. Safer than living with regrets. James climbed in. The boat rocked gently. The old man handed them fishing lines. Now, patience, he said. The fish will come. The sun lowered, painting the sky in gold. James watched the horizon, lost in thought. A sudden pull on his line startled him. Mark cheered. You got one? James struggled, pulling the fish from the water. It was small, but he felt victorious. The old man smiled. Not bad for a first catch. As night fell, they returned to shore. They lit a small fire on the sand. Mark grilled the fish, the smell filling the air. James took a bite. It was simple, but perfect. He sighed. I never knew life could be like this. Mark smiled. Sometimes, the best moments are the simplest. The ocean whispered as the waves kissed the shore. James closed his eyes, feeling truly at peace. The small town was alive with music and laughter. James and Mark walked through the crowded square. People danced in circles, hands clapping to the rhythm. James stopped, watching the dancers move so freely. Mark grinned. "Looks fun, right?" James hesitated. "I don't know how to dance." Mark nudged him. "Then tonight is the perfect time to learn." James shook his head. "I'll just embarrass myself." Mark sighed. "No one here cares. Just have fun." A young woman approached, her dress flowing as she twirled. "Hey," she said. "Want to dance?" James blinked, unsure. I can't really dance." She smiled. "That's okay. Just follow my lead." Mark gave him a little push. "Go on, James." Taking a deep breath, James stepped into the dance floor. The music surrounded him, warm and inviting. She took his hand, guiding him with gentle steps. At first, he was stiff, his movements awkward. "Relax," she whispered. "Feel the music." James closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm. Slowly, he began to move, step by step. For the first time, he forgot about his illness. Laughter echoed around him, and he smiled. Mark stood by, watching with satisfaction. He turned to Lily. "Thank you for asking him." Lily glanced at James. "He deserves to feel free." Mark's expression softened, even just for one night. James spun under the lights, feeling weightless. The city shimmered, laughter blending with the melody. For the first time in years, he truly danced. The old house stood silent, untouched by time. James hesitated at the doorstep, heart pounding. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. "You ready?" James exhaled slowly. "I have to do this." He knocked. The sound echoed through the house. After a long pause, the door creaked open. His father stood there, eyes shadowed with age. "You finally came back," his father said coldly. James swallowed. "I wanted to see you." His father turned away. "Why now?" James stepped inside, memories flooding back. The same wooden table, the same old chair. But the warmth was gone, replaced by silence. His father sat down, sighing heavily. "You never wrote, you never called." James lowered his gaze. "I was afraid." His father scoffed. "Afraid? Of your own family?" James clenched his fists. "You never listened." A tense silence stretched between them. Mark shifted uncomfortably, watching the exchange. His father sighed. "Then talk. I'm listening now." James took a deep breath. "I was sick." His father's eyes flickered. "Sick? Since when?" "Since before I left. I didn't want pity." His father stared at him, jaw tightening. "You thought I wouldn't care." His voice cracked. James looked away. "I wasn't sure." His father rubbed his temples, exhaling sharply. "You were always stubborn," he muttered. James let out a small, bitter laugh. "Guess I got that from you," he said. For the first time, his father almost smiled. Silence settled again, but it felt lighter. James finally said, "I don't want to run anymore." His father nodded. "Then stay. Let's talk." James took a seat, feeling a weight lift. The past still lingered, but healing had begun. James sat by the window, pen trembling in hand. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, whispering softly. He took a deep breath and started to write. "Dear Mom, I hope you're doing well. I wish I had told you I was sick. But I didn't want to make you worry. You always took care of me, even when I was grown. Now, I want to say thank you." Tears blurred his vision, but he kept writing. "Dear Emily, my little sister, my light. I won't be there to see you graduate. But I know you'll do amazing things. You're smart, strong, and kinder than anyone I know. Promise me you'll keep smiling, no matter what." The ink smudged as he wiped his eyes. He reached for another sheet of paper. "Dear Mark, my best friend, my brother. I don't know how to say goodbye. You were there when I was lost, when I was scared, when I wanted to give up. You never let me feel alone. I don't deserve a friend like you, but I was lucky enough to have you." James set the pen down, his hand shaking. He folded the letters carefully, sealing each one. The moonlight streamed in, casting soft shadows. For the first time, he felt at peace. Even if he couldn't stay, his words would remain. James looked up at the sky, a feeling of excitement building inside him. He had always dreamed of flying, of feeling the wind beneath his wings. Mark smiled at him, handing over the glider's straps. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, his voice full of excitement. James nodded, though his heart raced with nervousness. He stepped to the edge of the cliff, gazing down at the vast valley below. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then, he took a deep breath and leaped forward. The wind caught the wings, and he soared into the air. The world below him became a blur, and all that mattered was the sky. James felt free, weightless, like he was a part of the wind itself. With his arms outstretched, he closed his eyes and shouted, "This is what it feels like to live." The wind howled around him, but his spirit soared higher. Mark followed close behind, laughing in the wind. "You're doing great," Mark called out, his voice faint against the wind. But James barely heard him, lost in the feeling of flight. He flew over mountains and valleys, feeling more alive than ever before. For the first time, his illness didn't matter. Nothing did. It was just him, the sky, and the wind. When he landed back on the ground, his heart still raced with excitement. Mark greeted him with a grin. "How was it?" James smiled, his face shining with joy. "It was everything I've ever wanted," he said, his voice filled with wonder. He looked up at the sky one more time, feeling a sense of peace. For that moment, he was free, truly free. And for once, he didn't worry about the future. James felt a change within him, a quiet acceptance he had never known before. His body, once full of strength, now seemed fragile, worn by time. But he no longer feared it. Instead, he embraced it with a peaceful heart. He decided it was time to go home, to be with the people who mattered most. Mark understood, and without hesitation, helped him prepare for the journey. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked softly, concern in his eyes. James nodded, his voice steady. "It's time to say goodbye." The journey back home felt long, but each moment was filled with meaning. As they approached his childhood home, memories began flooding his mind. He remembered the sound of laughter, the smell of his mother's cooking, the warmth of family. When he stepped inside, his mother was there, waiting, as if she had never left. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He walked to her, taking her hands in his. "I'm home, Mom." Tears welled in her eyes as she held him close. "I've missed you so much." He could feel her love, warm and unconditional, and he allowed himself to surrender to it. Over the next few days, he spent time with his family and friends, cherishing every moment. They laughed, shared stories, and held him close, offering him comfort in their presence. James no longer worried about the future. He had found peace in the present. As the days passed, he grew weaker, but his heart was full. He had lived, truly lived, surrounded by those he loved. One evening, as the sun set, he sat with Mark, his old friend, by his side. "Thank you," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark smiled, squeezing his hand. I'll always be here for you. James closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the world around him. For the first time in a long while, he was content. He was ready for the next journey, no longer afraid of the unknown. And as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a sense of peace that transcended all fear. This was the final chapter, but it was one filled with love, warmth, and acceptance. And in that moment, James knew he had truly come home. The night before he passed, James asked Mark for one last promise. "Take care of Emily," James whispered, his voice weak but firm. Mark nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the request. He had always been there for James, but this promise felt different. James smiled faintly, relieved to know that someone he trusted would watch over her. The next morning, Mark awoke to find James had passed away quietly in his sleep. He sat by the bed, staring at his old friend's peaceful face, trying to understand. Then, his eyes fell upon the small note left beside him. It was a simple note, but its words held more weight than any treasure. "We will eventually fade away," the note read, "but our love and courage will never die." Mark's hand trembled as he read the words again, the truth sinking in. James had always been a man of few words, but those words would live on forever. He understood now, more than ever, the importance of carrying that love forward. Mark vowed to keep his promise, to watch over Emily as his own. And as he left the room, the note in his hand, he whispered, "I'll make sure of it." The days that followed were filled with grief, but also with a newfound sense of purpose. Mark knew that even though James was gone, his spirit would always be with them. The legacy of love and courage that James left behind was something no one could erase. And in that way, James would continue to live on in the hearts of those who loved him. With every act of kindness, every moment of bravery, his spirit would endure. And as the years passed, Mark found himself telling others about James' final words. Because in those words, there was more than just a farewell. There was a promise to live, to love, and to be courageous, no matter what. And so, even as the world moved on, James' love and courage remained eternal.